Hey guys, it's Neffy. Thanks for tuning in with me yet again. I am the urban apologist here to defend the Christian faith by any means necessary. I'm joking. By only means of truth. So as you know, sometimes I will get fed up with a particular line of reasoning and it will just provoke the necessity to create a video. So here we are. The topic for today is how you gonna be a Christian and your ancestors was forced to praise Jesus under the threat of a whip. So this is a very common argument, particularly for African Americans. People will always use that, it was beaten into us. They had the whip in one hand and say I love Jesus, say it, right? And I am here to tell you that I am still investigating, and it has been 3 years since I started this particular line of investigation, looking for primary source material, firsthand accounts, whether they be court records, whether they be narratives. I am looking for firsthand accounts that this actually happened, that this actually took place, where slaves were being forced by violence to worship Jesus here in the United States. And I understand that the question may be a different, maybe take on a different tone in other countries, but we're dealing with the United States, particularly because that's where at least half of my ancestors come from. So, So there's also another argument that slaves were enticed to become Christian because Christians couldn't enslave other Christians. So the idea is you would get baptized, and then your master would just have to let you go free. You don't know, that's the law. They on the law, they gotta let you go if you a Christian. And for a little bit, that was accurate in terms of Christians couldn't enslave other Christians, but that only caused slave masters to want to keep Christianity as far away from their slaves as possible, because obviously they don't want to interfere with their own trade. They don't want to interfere with their own income. So they kept Christianity away from slaves. It wasn't an enticement necessarily to the slave masters for them to beat Christianity into us, because it would be contrary to their own pockets to do so. So for a while, there was that hesitancy with regards to exposing Christianity to slaves, because they didn't want them to get baptized and then not be able to continue to keep them as slaves. So, as with any other thing, they turned to the law. And the law basically introduced this idea that no, we don't care about all that, man. Don't worry about all that. Go ahead, baptize your slaves if you want to. They still gonna be slaves. So good day for the Europeans, right? Now that doesn't necessarily make it an enticement for African Americans or an enticement for European Americans to introduce Christianity to their slaves. In fact, they were still very apprehensive about it, because more than physical liberation, Christianity posed a threat in the form of mental and spiritual liberation. You feel me? They recognized that from the very beginning. Their fear was that slaves becoming Christians would see themselves as children of God and think themselves equal, God forbid, right? Think themselves equal to European Americans, and therefore, kind of attack the whole oppression thing. We can't have that. So here I have today for you some evidence of slave masters who were trying to keep their slaves from becoming Christians by any means. Now, if you go on my Facebook page, Facebook.com/Nefertiti, you will find at least, I'm going to say, about a dozen of these accounts. I'm only going to read 3 or 4 for you here today, because it can get time consuming and I don't want to keep y'all all day. But if you're really interested, I'm going to pour some sources at the end. And I may even throw an extra couple of slides in here so that you can read them for yourselves without me having to read them to you, right? So check me out on Facebook, Instagram also, because Instagram is just images, so you can scroll through the images and see my posts. But check my photo section on Facebook as well. So what I do is I do research, because this is a passion of mine, and then I put the information on a meme. So I'll grab an image, an attention-grabbing image, and I'll quote the source that I got the information from. So you'll get the quote, you'll get the citation, and you'll get an image, and it's on a meme. And so this is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So the first one that I wanted to share with you is one by Uncle Tom Jones. So there is a work of fiction, a work of fiction that was created by the abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was gaining wide popularity. But this particular narrative was written by another man who was named Tom. An uncle was something that they call slaves as a form of respect. One slave, more African American, would call another uncle or auntie. And so uncle, he just happened to use that because he knew the popularity of that title. He used it at that time to gain popularity for his own narrative. And let me slow down. So a caveat: a slave narrative is a first-hand account of the African American slave experience in their own words. And so a lot of times they were freed and they would write their own books, like Frederick Douglass wrote his own autobiography. It also touches on aspects of Christianity and slavery, and you'll definitely want to check that out. And then we also have people who were a part of the Works Progress Association, who post-emancipation went around carrying these huge recorders and recording interviews with slaves firsthand, or former slaves at this point rather, and asking them questions about their experience. So you have those as well. And again, I'm going to post that in the sources. So this one I read one Friday night. I can still remember laying in my bed, stayed up all night reading through narratives, and this one caught my attention and I was in tears. My husband came to me and he was like, listen, if you feel this moved by this information, obviously this is something that God has put on your heart, so you need to continue to pursue it. And I took my husband's advice and I'm still doing that. So here you'll see the caption is "Slave Beaten for Attending Church." It says, he said, speaking of the master, he said, "Didn't I tell you I would whip you if you went nigh these meetings? And didn't I tell you to stop this foolish praying?" I told him he did. And if he would, why, he might whip me. But still, I could not stop praying because I wanted to be good, that I might be happy and go to heaven. He ordered me to strip off my clothes. And as I did so, he took down the cowhide, heavy and stiff with blood, which he had before drawn from my body with that cruel weapon, and which was congealed upon it. He then whipped me with great severity, inflicting terrible pain at every blow upon my quivering body, which was still very tender from recent lacerations. My suffering was so great that it seemed to me that I should die. So if you're unfamiliar with narratives and the way that they spoke at the time, you may not be aware of what some of the terminology means. So when he says meetings, and when you read, you can pull up Uncle Tom's narrative. You can pull up this narrative online, but when you read it, you'll find that he elaborates as to what the meetings were and the whole context of the situation. So when it says here meetings, he's talking about church meetings. When he says here, I wanted to be good, he's saying that he wanted to be filled with the Holy Spirit. That's a term that they use. They also called it happy, and that's why he says that I might be happy. He's talking about the joy of the Spirit, and that he wanted to go to heaven. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Here is it's called a book called Slavery Days in Old Kentucky, published in 1901. And I'm going to read to you here. It says, his wife, speaking of the master once again, his wife was a devout Catholic. And while master was gone, she used to gather the slaves remaining each morning in her dining room and teach them prayers. And some of the younger ones she taught to read. When the master returned in the spring and learned what she had been doing, he was very angry. He had always told his slaves that he was their Lord and master, and now informed them his wife should not have told them of any other Lord. From Rosa, we learn that he lectured his wife for her conduct about as follows: if you teach them to pray and read, they may think they are human beings, and we will not be able to keep them as slaves. The more ignorant we keep them about such things, the better slaves they are. After this, my dear wife, you must never teach a Negro the Lord's Prayer or any other prayer. So once again, this is showing their disdain for, or their fear of having slaves believe that they were Christians, think of themselves as human. Obviously, the thought being pushed at the time was that we were subhuman in order to justify slavery. And we can talk about each one of these things, each one of these topics in a different, more lengthy video. And I'm trying to keep this short, but I also want to do it justice. So just know and be on the lookout for future videos as well addressing this very subject, because it's very broad, and like I said, you can pick it apart. So that particular issue of European Americans fearing our conversion or our change of perception is a very huge point, and one that I intend to spend more time on. I'm also going to do a video on How to Make a Negro a Christian and The Religious Instruction of the Negroes, those two books. So be on the lookout for that. Let's move on. It says here, many years ago, my white folks did not want me even to pray and would whip me for praying, saying it was foolishness for me to pray. But the old master whipped me. But the more old master whipped me, the more I prayed. Sometimes he put me in jail, but Lord me, it did not stop me from praying. I'd kneel down on the jail floor and pray often, and nearly all day Sundays. I'd fall asleep sometimes praying. This was Sister Charlotte Brooks from the House of Bondage, published in 1890. So once again, she's saying that he didn't want her to pray and that he beat her for it, but she would continue to do it anyway. One of my favorite accounts I'm going to post at the end in silence just for you to read it, about praying Jacob. You'll definitely want to check that out. And so the last one I'm going to read for you now here is a former slave by the name of Thomas Anderson. It's a rather lengthy, so it says, slave beaten for following Christ. My master, who owned me at that time, having no knowledge of God or godliness, supposed my religion was all a fancy, and said he could whip it out of me. He took me up and tied me and scourged me until the feeling of the flesh was almost gone. At length I fall before him and lift up my cries to heaven and ask my great Creator, what have I done? My master cursed me and said, will you preach to me? But I now feel glad that I could suffer patiently for my new master. And my manner at that time take master's strength away. And before he left me, he untied me and let me off. But in about 3 hours, he come again and threatened me with a fresh scourging. And though I was very weak from the beating I got, the Lord made me feel very strong. And this prepared me to answer, you have whipped out all fear, and I am not afraid of you no more. You can take a gun and shoot me or kill me as you please, and all for nothing. And that is all you can do, for I know I have a life you cannot touch, and the fear of you will not keep me from doing anything my new master tells me to do. And if he let you take this poor bruised body of flesh, I feel it ain't worth much, and I feel strength to say something like this: thy will, O God, be done and not mine. After this, my old master was conquered, and he never whipped me again and left me in the hands of Jehovah. So, guys, these were just 4 pieces of evidence that I had for you guys today, just to get the idea, to counter that narrative that we've been taught. We've been told that we were forced into Christianity. And some other things that we will discuss in future videos is the fact that, again, we have these conversion stories where people are telling you that they went against their master's wishes. There's also reports of Europeans being arrested for teaching Christianity to slaves. If it was something that they all wanted, why would it be against the law? You know, why would he have been arrested? Another counter argument to that is the presence of conjurmen. So the conjurmen is something that you'll also come across in the narratives should you choose to read them, and it's basically like a witch doctor or the voodoo man. So we have to keep in mind that Africans were being imported to the United States until 1808 and probably later. But the act prohibiting the importation of slaves went into effect in 1808. And there's, of course, probably were some smuggling going on long afterwards. But let's just stay with the official facts. So in 1808 is when they stopped bringing Africans here. That means that since the beginning of slavery up until at least 1808, we know that there have been fresh indigenous Africans being brought to the United States. And these people would have been bringing their indigenous faith systems and their practices here with them. And we have evidence of that because here in America, we have a lot of presence of indigenous aspects of worship, even some being mingled with Christianity. So we see these things here being present, and yet we say they weren't allowed to practice any other religion. Now, in some cases, of course, on the books, it would have been illegal for them to do so, but that never physically stopped them from practicing Christianity or practicing their indigenous faith systems. For example, we know that in the Caribbean and in Louisiana, for example, Africans would mask their gods that they were worshiping from their homeland by giving them attributing them to Catholic saints. So to the outside eye, it would look like they were praying to Saint Peter, but in reality, they were praying to whatever their indigenous god was, and that was one way that their faith system survived through slavery. So what I'm saying is, they weren't able to force them out of their indigenous practices. If you'll read through the narratives, that there were people who tried to convince Christian slaves of becoming more more in touch with their indigenous roots and stop worrying about the white man religion. This is an ancient argument, but it doesn't really hold weight. So what they were saying was that if you could perform certain spells to keep yourself from being beaten by the slave master, and people mock that. A lot of Africans also mocked it because they saw that it wasn't fruitful for them. You know, trying all these different roots and carrying certain herbs in your pocket and spitting in the slave master's direction to try to keep him from beating you, that didn't work. So another thing that I'll touch on in the future video is the role Christianity played in the abolition movement, which doesn't get enough attention or respect as it deserves. So these were just, again, I tried to keep it succinct, but this is obviously a subject that I'm very passionate about, and so I could go on forever, but I'm gonna cut it off right here. I'm gonna leave you with a couple of more of the memes that I've created for you to look at. The sources are there. If you have any questions, feel free to inbox me. I am on several platforms: YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. Make sure you like, comment, tell me how you feel about this video. Like, is this information new to you? Make sure you share it. Like I always say, you may not be personally impacted by this information, but by you putting it out there and sharing it on your timeline or in your social media, it may come across the path of somebody who really needs it. And that's the whole intent, is to save souls out here with the truth. So make sure you like, comment, subscribe, share, follow, depending on the platform, whatever the case is. And feel free always to inbox me. Knowledge is power. All power to the people. Jesus Christ be praised. I love you.